November 6th, 1956. 3 o'clock in the morning. Anthony Eden lies awake in his bedroom at 10 Downing Street. His hands shake. Not from cold, from rage, mixed with something worse. Fear. The red telephone on his nightstand has been ringing for 6 minutes. He knows who it is. He knows what they want. And he knows that in about 6 hours, Britain's foreign currency reserves will hit zero. His wife, Clarissa, stares at him from across the room. "Anthony," she whispers. "Answer it." He doesn't move. Because the voice on the other end isn't just another world leader. It's the man who controls Britain's bank account. Across the English Channel, in a tent outside Port Said, French generals huddle over maps bathed in lamplight. Their paratroopers hold the city. Egyptian forces are scattered. The Suez Canal, the artery of European oil, is theirs for the taking. General Anderboef lights a cigarette, exhales slowly, and waits for the order to advance. It will never come. Because 3,000 miles away, in the Oval Office, a 66-year-old American president is holding something more powerful than aircraft carriers, more devastating than nuclear bombs. A ledger. The question isn't whether Britain and France will withdraw from Egypt. The question is whether Britain will still be a functioning economy by the time they do. Because here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Britain didn't lose the Suez War to Egypt. They lost it to their accountant. And that accountant's name was Dwight Eisenhower. This is the story of how the world's largest empire discovered it had been living on a credit card. And the day the bill came due, America was holding the only pen that mattered. Let's be clear about the hierarchy. In 1956, if you walked into any British pub, any schoolhouse, any government office, you'd see the same thing. Maps. Big, beautiful maps with a third of the world colored pink. The British Empire. The sun never sets. Rule Britannia. Britain still had nuclear weapons. They had the Royal Navy, hundreds of ships, global reach, centuries of maritime dominance. They had colonies on every continent and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The British government genuinely believed they were still a superpower. But maps lie. The real map wasn't drawn in pink ink. It was drawn in ledgers, black and red, assets and liabilities. And in those ledgers, Britain looked like a man with $220 in his checking account, carrying a $375 balance on his credit card, buying rounds at the bar and pretending everything's fine. Britain owed the United States $3.75 billion. Their entire foreign currency reserves? $2.2 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's insolvency with a naval uniform. And America knew it. Eisenhower didn't need to send bombers to London. He didn't need to blockade British ports or threaten invasion. He just needed to make one thing abundantly clear. If you go into Egypt without my permission, I will call your loan. Eden, stubborn and desperate, went anyway. And this is where it gets worse. Because the Suez Crisis wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. And Britain built it themselves. To understand how, you have to go back 12 years earlier, to a summer night in 1944, to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, to a resort hotel called the Mount Washington, where 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered to redesign the financial architecture of the entire world. Outside, Europe is burning. The war is still raging. Inside, men in wool suits and round glasses are deciding what money will mean after the guns go silent. They're deciding who controls it, what it's backed by, and, most importantly, who gets to print it without consequences. Britain sends John Maynard Keynes. At 61, Keynes is the most famous economist in the world, the man who redefined how governments think about spending, debt, and unemployment during the Great Depression. He spent his entire career defending Britain's financial independence, its monetary sovereignty, its ability to manage its own economic destiny. He arrives in New Hampshire exhausted but optimistic. This is a negotiation. Britain may be weakened by war, but it's still an empire, still a great power. America sends Harry Dexter White, a mid-level Treasury official. Nobody's heard of him. He's holding a 300-page blueprint written in Washington, reviewed by the State Department, approved by the President. Keynes arrives thinking this is a negotiation. It's not. White has the votes. He has the vaults. And most crucially, he has the gold. By the end of the conference, White has rewritten the rules of global currency. The US dollar is now anchored to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency, British pounds, French francs, German marks, is anchored to the dollar. And if your currency gets weak, if your economy stumbles, if traders lose confidence, if your reserves start draining, you don't devalue on your own anymore. You go begging to a new institution called the International Monetary Fund, which, by the way, America controls. Keynes sees what's happening. He tries to salvage British dignity. He proposes his own system, something elegant, balanced, where no single country holds the whip. He calls it Bancor, a supranational reserve currency managed by a global clearing union, a system where Britain and America would be equals, where smaller countries wouldn't be at the mercy of Washington's financial diktat. The Americans smile politely and vote it down. Keynes returns to London exhausted, humiliated, beaten. He'd spent 6 weeks arguing with men who had already decided the outcome before he stepped off the boat. 2 years later, on Easter Sunday 1946, John Maynard Keynes dies of a heart attack at age 62. Some historians say the stress of Bretton Woods killed him. Others say he simply saw the future, saw what Britain had become, and couldn't bear it. What he saw was this: Britain had just signed a contract that made American approval a prerequisite for British solvency. On paper, it looked like international cooperation. In reality, it was a leash. And here's the irony that makes this whole thing tragic. The British public loved it. Because Bretton Woods came with a loan. $3.75 billion from Washington, the largest loan in history at the time. Britain would use it to rebuild bombed cities, restart factories, keep the pound stable, maintain the illusion that empire still meant something. Newspapers celebrated. America bails out Britain. Special relationship saves the day. The elites knew better. They knew the loan came with conditions. Fixed exchange rates, meaning Britain couldn't devalue the pound without IMF approval, no capital controls without American consent, no independent monetary policy. Every economic decision would now require a phone call to Washington. Britain had traded sovereignty for liquidity. But the public didn't read the fine print. They saw dollars flowing in. They saw ration cards slowly disappearing. They saw Britain still on the map, still pink, still proud. What they didn't see was the safety valve being welded shut. Because here's how the trap works. In the old world, before Bretton Woods, before the war, back when Britain actually controlled its own currency, if your economy got sick, you had options. Brutal options. Painful options. But yours. You could devalue your currency to make exports cheaper and kickstart manufacturing. You could impose capital controls to stop money from fleeing the country. You could default on debt, take the immediate pain, start fresh. It was economic warfare against your own people. But it was sovereign warfare. You controlled the weapons. Bretton Woods removed all of that. Now, if your currency dropped, you couldn't just devalue. You had to ask permission from the IMF. And the IMF's biggest shareholder, the one with veto power over every major decision, was the United States. The script was always the same. You want a loan? We'll give you one. But first, you'll cut government spending. You'll raise interest rates to defend the currency. You'll open your markets to American goods. You'll do exactly what we say, when we say it, in the order we say it. And if you say no, the markets do it for you. Because every currency trader in London and New York now knows one thing. Britain can't move without Washington's approval. So the second Britain looks weak, the second reserves start falling, the second a crisis hits, the money runs. And the second the money runs, Britain has no choice but to come crawling back to the IMF, hat in hand, asking for terms. It's not a safety net. It's a noose. And for a decade, it works fine, as long as Britain behaves. But empires don't behave. They posture. By the mid-1950s, the cracks are everywhere. India gained independence in 1947. The jewel in the crown? Gone. Palestine dissolved into chaos, and Britain just walked away. Iran nationalized its oil fields in 1951, and Britain couldn't do a damn thing about it except sulk and scheme. The Malayan emergency is bleeding money and soldiers into the jungle. Colonial administrations are collapsing faster than London can prop them up. The empire is dying. Everyone knows it. But no one in Westminster will say it out loud. And then, on July 26, 1956, a 38-year-old Egyptian colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser walks up to a microphone in Alexandria in front of a crowd of 250,000 people and says the one sentence Britain cannot tolerate: we are nationalizing the Suez Canal. The crowd erupts. Nasser grins. And in London, Anthony Eden's face goes white. Because the canal isn't just strategic, it's symbolic. It's the artery of empire. 2/3 of Europe's oil flows through that 120-mile ditch. British oil from the Persian Gulf to British refineries in Europe. Britain technically gave up ownership in 1954 as part of a negotiated withdrawal, but they assumed Egypt would stay quiet, pliant, cooperative. A client state in all but name. Nasser is none of those things. He's young, charismatic, fearless. The Arab street loves him. The Soviets are backing him with weapons and money. And the Americans, who've spent the last decade trying to peel the Third World away from European colonialism, are watching very, very carefully. Eden sees Nasser as Hitler reborn, a dictator who must be stopped early, before he sparks a cascade, before appeasement becomes the policy again. Eden's generation remembers Munich. They remember Chamberlain waving that stupid piece of paper. They remember the cost of waiting too long. So Eden decides we take it back by force. He calls the French, who are equally furious because Nasser is funding Algerian rebels fighting for independence. Together, in secret meetings in suburban Paris villas, they draw up a plan. It's elegant, cynical, brilliant, if you ignore the part where it violates international law. Israel will invade Egypt through the Sinai. Britain and France will issue an ultimatum. Both sides withdraw from the canal, or we intervene as peacekeepers. When Egypt refuses, and they will refuse, British and French forces seize the canal, depose Nasser, install a friendly government, and restore the old order. They call it Operation Musketeer. They don't call Washington. October 29th, 1956. Israeli forces cross into the Sinai. Tanks roll. Artillery fires. Egyptian forces scatter. October 30th. Britain and France issue their pre-scripted ultimatum. Both sides must withdraw from the canal zone within 12 hours. Egypt, predictably, says no. Israel, also predictably, says no. The trap is sprung. October 31st, British bombers hit Egyptian airfields. Runways crack. Hangars explode. The Egyptian Air Force is wiped out in hours. November 5th, British and French paratroopers land at Port Said. The city falls before nightfall. Casualties are light. The operation is, militarily, a stunning success. Eden allows himself a moment of satisfaction. Perhaps the empire isn't dead after all. Perhaps one decisive show of force is all it takes to remind the world who's still in charge. November 6th. The phone rings. Here's what the British public saw. An American president standing in front of cameras, condemning colonialism, defending the UN, supporting the rule of law, standing with the underdog. Here's what Eden saw. The bill. Because Eisenhower didn't send troops to stop Britain. He didn't need to. He just did three things. First, he picked up the phone and told the IMF to block Britain's request for a $561 million emergency loan. Britain had applied for it on November 5th, expecting routine approval. Instead, they got silence. Second, he blocked Britain's access to $600 million from the U.S. Export-Import Bank, another source of dollar liquidity, gone. Third, and this is the killer, he threatened to do something so devastating that just the rumor of it sent British Treasury officials into full panic mode. He threatened to sell the U.S. government's massive holdings of British pound sterling on the open market. If he did that, if the United States dumped billions of pounds onto currency markets, the pound would collapse. Sterling would lose 20, maybe 30% of its value overnight. Britain's foreign exchange reserves, already draining, would evaporate completely. Imports would freeze. Fuel shortages would cripple the country. Inflation would spike. Every pension, every savings account, every wage tied to the pound would lose value. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, Britain could do to stop it. Eden could keep his tanks in Egypt. He could hold Port Said for weeks, months even, but he'd come home to economic collapse. Riots in the streets. His own party turning on him. The empire liquidated to pay grocery bills. The trap snapped shut. On the morning of November 6th, Britain's foreign reserves were hemorrhaging tens of millions of pounds per day. By that evening, Eden called Washington and agreed to a ceasefire. 72 hours. That's how long it took for America to end the British Empire. Not with a bullet, with a ledger. The French were blindsided. They had troops on the ground. They had momentum. Victory was within sight. And then their ally, Britain, the great empire, the nuclear power, the nation that had stood against Hitler, folded like a cheap suit because of a phone call. French Prime Minister Guy Mollet couldn't believe it. He called Eden, furious. We had them, Anthony. We had Nasser. Why are we stopping? Eden, voice hollow, replied, we have no choice. Why not? Because, Eden said, we're out of money. France learned two lessons that week. First, Britain was no longer a reliable partner. Second, independence required something Britain no longer had, financial sovereignty. Within months, France began developing its own nuclear deterrent, independent of NATO. Within years, Charles de Gaulle would pull France out of NATO's integrated military command entirely. If Britain couldn't be trusted to defy Washington, France would have to do it alone. But here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. This wasn't just about Suez. It was about what Suez revealed. Because Britain's real problem wasn't Egypt. It wasn't Nasser. It wasn't even Eisenhower. It was a quiet, boring, technical mechanism that almost nobody outside the Treasury understood. But that made Britain's entire financial system a hostage. It's called the sterling area. Here's how it worked. For decades, Britain's colonies and former colonies, India, Australia, South Africa, Egypt, Malaysia, dozens of others, held their foreign reserves in British pounds, deposited in London banks. In return, Britain guaranteed the value of those pounds and managed currency policy for the whole bloc. Think of it like a monetary empire overlaid on the political empire. It was a beautiful deal for Britain, because it meant Britain could print money, spend it on imperial administration and military adventures, and never face an immediate reckoning. The colonies would hold the pounds, Britain would hold the gold, everyone stayed liquid. But by 1956, the system was breaking, because those countries weren't colonies anymore. They were independent nations with their own parliaments, their own central banks, their own populations demanding answers, and those populations were watching Britain invade Egypt, a fellow member of the sterling area, and asking a very simple question. If Britain will bomb one of us, why should we trust them with our money? The second they stopped trusting, the second India, Australia, and South Africa started withdrawing pounds and converting them to dollars or gold, Britain's reserves would collapse. Not because of Nasser, because of Australia, because of India, because of South Africa. The sterling area was a mutual hostage system. Britain could print, but only as long as the colonies held. And Suez proved Britain couldn't be trusted with the trigger. This was the nightmare scenario British Treasury officials discussed in locked rooms at 2 a.m, but never admitted in public. A cascading loss of confidence, not from enemies, but from allies. Eisenhower didn't need to destroy Britain. He just needed to remind the Commonwealth that America was the safer bet. And this is where the thriller becomes a tragedy. Because the crisis didn't end with Britain. While British troops were withdrawing from Egypt in November 1956, Soviet tanks were crushing a revolution in Hungary. Students, workers, intellectuals, people who dared to demand freedom from Moscow were being slaughtered in the streets of Budapest. The world was watching two imperial powers, one Western, one Soviet, suppress smaller nations in the exact same week. And the Americans had a choice: condemn both or condemn neither. Eisenhower condemned both, which meant Britain wasn't just losing a war, they were losing their geopolitical cover. For a decade, the U.S. had tolerated British colonialism, the dirty wars in Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, because Britain was a Cold War ally, a buffer against Soviet expansion, a reliable vote in the UN. But Suez shattered that logic. If Britain was going to act like a rogue empire, dragging America into conflicts without consultation, ignoring international law, embarrassing Washington on the world stage, then America would treat them like one, a liability. And once that shift happened, the entire post-war order started cracking. France saw it and began building an independent nuclear deterrent. West Germany saw it and started quietly rethinking its total military dependence on NATO. The non-aligned movement, countries like India, Indonesia, Yugoslavia, saw it and realized they could play Washington against Moscow, extracting concessions from both. Suez didn't just end British imperialism, it announced a new rule for the world: sovereignty is proportional to your balance sheet. So what happens next? There are three futures. And in 1956, Britain is trapped between all of them. Future one, full integration. Britain dissolves itself into a larger union, whether Atlantic, European, or Commonwealth, and accepts that monetary sovereignty is dead. That independence is a luxury only superpowers can afford. They federate, pool resources, and survive as a province of something bigger. It's survival. But it's not Britain anymore. Future 2, managed decline. Britain stays nominally independent, but fiscally dependent. Every crisis requires American or IMF approval. Every major reform is vetted in Washington. Sovereignty in name, supervision in fact. A slow, dignified, agonizing fade into irrelevance. It's what actually happened. Future 3, the break. Britain says no. Defaults on debt, exits Bretton Woods, reintroduces capital controls, devalues the pound unilaterally, and takes the pain. An economic cataclysm in the short term. Mass unemployment, inflation, international isolation. But a gamble on sovereignty in the long term. In 1956, Eden tried a version of Future 3, and America showed him exactly what happens when you don't control your own currency. By January 1957, Eden resigned. Officially, for health reasons, his bile duct had been damaged in a botched surgery, and he was in constant pain. Unofficially, because he'd just learned what every mid-tier power learns eventually, you can have an empire, or you can have an economy. You can't have both on someone else's credit card. The canal stayed in Egyptian hands. Nasser became a hero, not just in Egypt, but across the Arab world and the entire Third World. The man who stood up to empires and won. Oil kept flowing. Shipping resumed. Within months, it was as if the invasion had never happened, except for one humiliating detail. Britain introduced petrol rationing in December 1956, not because of the war, not because Egypt had cut off supply, but because they couldn't afford to buy fuel in dollars. The rationing lasted until May 1957. Britons lined up at petrol stations with coupons like it was 1943 all over again. The empire that once ruled the seas was now rationing gasoline at home because a man in Washington decided they'd overspent. The doors were locked. The key was held by America. And Britain had welded them shut themselves 12 years earlier in a hotel in New Hampshire, thinking they were signing a loan. They were signing a contract. And the fine print said, "Your independence is now conditional." If you want to understand how power really works, not through speeches or tanks, but through the boring, hidden mechanisms that determine who can say no, start looking at the systems nobody wants you to see. The ones designed to look like safety nets. The ones that turn into cages. Because the next time a country waves a flag and calls itself sovereign, ask one question. Who holds their credit line? That's where the empire really is. I'm Malcolm, and this is History Meets Economics. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain why. Here's another moment history met economics.